For those folks in the audience, and for folks who will be eventually watching on video, my name is Michael Trammell, Director of Academics, Professional Learning, and Student Affairs in the Sanborn Regional School District. I'm here tonight representing the district to discuss the grading system that has evolved in the district over the course of the last 9 years. I will say, though, that I'm just a representative, even though I've been here through all phases of the redesign of our system, not just grading, but movement from a traditional system to a competency-based system, that the work that's been done has been the work completed by untold numbers of administrators and teachers. Some of our teachers are in the audience this evening, available for teacher-based questions if the need arises. Also, the work of students and parents. So some of the things that maybe folks in the audience don't know is that in the early stages, particularly as we were developing the system, parents gave us a lot of feedback. So one of the questions that arose earlier from the gentleman from Newton is why there are two different grades at the elementary versus middle and high school. That actually came about as a result of parent requests because parents were unsure about some of the language we had in our original grading scale. So we've been very responsive to working with our community members, and the work that I'm presenting tonight really is the work of a decade's worth of labor for all of our educators in the district. So first and foremost, hopefully through tonight's presentation, there are 4 goals that I would like to get to. First of all, hopefully folks will have an understanding about the rules that govern our implementation of competency-based learning in our district. There actually is a state law. There are minimum approval standards. As Mr. Stack, he stole my thunder a little bit. I'm actually going to talk about what those individual regulations say and why we do what we do. I also want folks to understand that the system that we developed to implement competency-based learning, I want you to understand that there are a lot of components to that system, but they're all interrelated. They work together as a system. I want to talk a little bit about the shortcomings of traditional models, and I want to talk about the system that we've built and how we've addressed some of those shortcomings. Hopefully, I will address the questions that many of you might ask. For some reason, my clicker's not working here. Okay, so I want to go back. So I have the unenviable task of condensing. I got it. Unenviable task of condensing 12 years worth of history into now 45 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Ambrose.
Okay, you can have 47 and a half.
20 and a half. So, first off, 2006, there is a movement by the New Hampshire School Board. So just like there is a school board for SAU 17, there is a school board that governs school systems at the state level. At that school board, later became law and regulations. We have ED 306.4, 306.27. That technical advisory describes what I've condensed for you here. That law said that by the beginning of the 2008-2009 school year, high schools must award credit based on the attainment or mastery of competencies. Limited it only to high schools at the time. Previous to that, schools were allowed to award credits either based on competency and attainment of competency or on seat time. So a traditional school that you might have gone to if you were my age, where you went through a course over a period of time, whether it was a semester or a year, usually there were a certain number of instructional hours that were required, and you have a passing grade at the end of that seat time. Seat time is no longer an acceptable means for high schools to award credits any longer. The only way that we can award credits are on the demonstration of mastery or competency. Now, that original law, 2006, was later, so as you can imagine, that law comes out and there's a flurry of movement in the state. Educators are now having to grapple with what does this mean for our system. Fortunate for us in the Sanborn district, we started the transformation process immediately. What does this mean? How will we track student learning? What does it mean for attainment of credits? What will it look for a transcript? How will this impact things like college acceptance and all these other things? The situation changed slightly in 2014 because in 2014 there was an amendment to the regulations that stated essentially that it's no longer just high schools, but K through 12 must be using mastery of competencies to determine the level of student learning, right? So now the system is required K through 12. Now, Mr. Stack mentioned minimum approval standards. So these regulations are also written in the minimum approval standards. And for those of you who are not aware of what that means, many of you know that our schools in the district are accredited. We are members of the New England Association of Schools and Colleges, and that means on an every 10-year basis, a decennial basis, there is a complex and complete review of our system. And we either get accreditation or we get recommendations. What most of you don't know is a similar model emanates from the state on an every 3-year basis. So every 3 years, we must prove to the state that we are meeting the minimum standards for school approval at each of our grade levels, elementary, middle, and high school. In order to be compliant with the state regulations, we must be competency-based. So what does that mean? How must we approach education differently, knowing that we must be competency-based? The first thing I want to address is the fact that New Hampshire is not alone in this transformation. This is a map, which you can go online. It's updated daily by an organization called INACOL. And the map shows state-level rules and regulations governing competency-based education. Those schools in orange, and you can see Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont are in orange there. Those are considered advanced states. Those are states that have policy that require competency-based education. And you can see there's a foothold in New England, also in the Mid-Atlantic, and in some states in the West. The schools in green, are schools that are moving. They're called developing. These are states that have regulations that promote competency-based education, but they may not have state-level law or district policy requirements governing the movement toward competency-based education. You can see there are a lot of green states there. California and some others, when I post this online, you'll see a little better. There are some states that have crosshatches. So there's California, Mississippi, Georgia, West Virginia, Wisconsin. These are states that are considered innovative lab network states. So they are actively promoting not only competency-based education, but personalized learning, which is a little bit of a twist on competency-based ed. So let's talk a little bit about how all the components of competency-based education fit together, because grading is one component. But over the course of our decade of work together, we've come to understand that there are about 31 elements that we have to consider in the system. How do I know there are 31? Because we haven't yet had a question that has arisen that we haven't been able to address by looking at one of these 31 design elements, okay? So we're going to talk a little bit about that. What I want you to gather from this is that the system is an interconnected system. You can't talk about grading without talking about assessment. You can't talk about assessment without talking about intervention. You can't talk about intervention without talking about bell schedules. So in a moment, I'm going to give you a graphic that we've created. This graphic, folks have asked for a long time, what's the roadmap? What do we do first? What do we do second? What do we do third? If we're moving from a traditional system to a competency-based system. I want you to think of those different colors. Up in the upper left-hand corner, on my screen it's orange. Over there it looks a little bit like red. We have all of the philosophical elements that you might have to consider. Grading philosophy is up there. Hiring practices, for example. You say, well, how are hiring practices connected with the competency-based system? Well, I will tell you that over the last 9 years, we've had to significantly change what we're looking for in applicants when we hire new teachers. Teachers are not necessarily being trained in a competency-based system, but yet we're expecting them to come in with this advanced level of teachership. Right? So it influences all of our philosophical conversations around everything, including hiring. In the upper right-hand corner, we have structural considerations, bell schedule, intervention. In the lower right-hand corner, leadership and decision-making types of things. And in the lower right-hand corner, this is the part that really touches upon the life of teachers. These are the teaching practices, things like assessment, development of rubrics, curriculum, instructional practices. These are the practices involved. what we're going to do is very quickly talk about how this landscape is an interconnected system. And I'm going to try to move through some of these. They will be posted on the website. The landscape as a whole, I want you to think of it like a spider's web or a food chain. So if you think about a spider's web, every one of those silk strands works as part of a system. If you're the unlucky insect that lands on this strand, there are going to be reverberations and vibrations throughout that entire spider web because it operates as a system. There are anchor strands, strands that are more important than others, that if they don't exist, the system doesn't work. If this anchor is not working and the system is flapping in the wind, an insect could land on that and it wouldn't matter. The spider won't know, right? It operates as a complex system. This is a food web I took out of a 4th grade science class textbook. All of these individual animals, right, are interdependent upon each other. The smallest animal in the system is blown up so you can see it. It's krill. If any one of these disappears from the food chain, the whole system could collapse. So it's interconnected. It all works together. That's a critical component. So you say, well, Michael, how does that map? How does that landscape map with all those 31 elements? How is that like a spider's web? Or how is it like the complex food web? If you take we're going to take a look at one little component here, assessment. And I've blown it up here so you can see. Assessment, formative, summative, performance. For educators, those words mean something to us. If, for example, we are starting off, like we did in 2009, rebuilding our system to become competency-based, required by law, required by minimum approval standards, how do you go about doing that? Well, the way we went about it was we didn't have money in professional development. You know, Mr. Ambrose talks last year a lot about the fact that we've done a lot with very little. You know, we didn't have any money for professional development. We couldn't bring experts in to teach us this stuff. So we did what teachers do. We read. We did all of the research ourselves. And we're going to talk a little bit about what the research says and what we've done. In order to answer, you know, how are we going to design an assessment system for competency-based learning, we literally sat down and we had a brainstorming session. And we said, what are all of the questions that we have to answer? Now, I'm not going to read these to you, but I'm going to tell you, I'll read a couple. There are 28 questions here that we have to answer in order to build a competency-based assessment model. What types of assessment are being used in my school today? You can't really go about redesigning a system until you know exactly what the system is like today. So we actually took an inventory, and we said to all of our teachers, please report to us the types of assessments, and please give us examples and samples of student work, and we collected all of that data. So we knew what our teachers were using for assessment, we knew what their skill set was, we knew areas that we might have to develop. That was something we had to research. Where do traditional tests excel, and how do they fit into our assessment system? Where do standardized tests excel? I'm just going to scroll through some of these. What is depth of knowledge? The gentleman from Newton asked a question about what is the difference between analyze and synthesis, right? That's really what we refer to as depth of knowledge, and I'm going to address that depth of knowledge kind of question in my presentation. What are rigor matrices? I'm going to show you what a rigor matrix is that our teachers would utilize in an English language arts classroom to design a performance assessment that measures competency. I'll just keep scrolling. What strategies will our schools utilize to make certain that our performance assessments are high quality? When we talk about a task that measures competency, it must be of high quality. It has to be vetted. First of all, it has to be valid. Valid means the assessment measures what you think it measures. It has to be reliable. I should be able to give that assessment in Miss Mosley's classroom and receive similar results to if I gave that same assessment in Miss Wolf's classroom, right? It has to be reliable. It has to be usable in multiple locations. It has to be comparable. The outcomes must be able to be compared. If something's truly, if Miss Mosley is making a determination that a student is competent in one particular strand, that same result should happen if the student took the assessment in Miss Wolf's classroom. We should be able to compare results on assessments. And lastly, there must be equity. We can't disadvantage some students by the way that we build our assessments. And I could go on at length about what I saw prior to our movement in the building of assessments, where teachers were unknowingly getting data that was biased based on the types of questions that were being asked. We just didn't think about it at the time. It's not like anybody was trying to be biased. How will our school assure a high degree of consistency in scoring so that a student that receives a 2 in one classroom would receive a 2 if they were given that same assessment by another teacher? Where do we start first? Rubrics, performance assessments? How are instruction and assessment connected in a competency-based system? Should we allow students to reassess if they don't demonstrate mastery or proficiency on the first try? Should we expect students to reassess? Those are two different questions. One is, are you going to give the kids the opportunity? And the other is, must you demand it from students because you are not going to allow them to move on in the curriculum until they showed mastery of all of the steps prior? So when we get through our research, we had 28 questions that we had to answer. So I'm going to give a quick demonstration now. We're going back to our landscape map. You know that there are 31 elements here, and we're starting off with the box here called assessment. If we were going to do a little test, and we were going to draw a connecting line between, let's say I gave one of the questions says, what are we going to do for students who don't demonstrate competency? Well, first off, I have to have a reporting mechanism. So I have to measure competency and report it somewhere that I can compare scores. So I'm going to draw a line from assessment to this box that says reporting. I may also say, well, kids that don't demonstrate competency are going to need some kind of reteaching or enrichment, so I'm going to draw a box to intervention. And what we find as we answer those 28 questions and we start with assessment, that assessment box is literally linked to every single other component in the system. So the reason why I can say with reasonable assuredness that there are 31 components to the model that we've built, we haven't yet had a question that hasn't somehow been able to be linked to one of these other 31 issues. There may come a point when we add something to our system, like for example, we've just designed what we refer to as a profile of a graduate that identifies the indicators of college student success. As we implement that, we may find that there's something that has to be added to our system, whether it's a tracking mechanism or some sort of program that we're going to implement. But to date, over the course of the last decade, all of the questions about assessment have been linked to one of these other boxes. So what I would like you to see is we're starting to develop the model that this is a system. If we looked at grading or grading philosophy, and I turn this over to you as an audience, and I know this because I've done this with other schools and other districts, if I said to you, write down all of your questions that you need to know about grading, we would come up with between 30 and 35, maybe 40 questions about how is grading going to be tackled in a competency-based system. And when I do this with groups, I usually start by giving them a few teasers, things to get them thinking. So you might ask, how will late work be graded in this system? What types of grading categories will we use? Is there a maximum grade that can be earned on a reassessment? What is the purpose of grading? That's a big one. You want to see teachers argue? Ask that question. So if we were going to then attack every one of those 35 or so some odd questions that you would have about grading, you would be able to connect the grading box to all 31 of these, right? So the point that I'm trying to make is that when you're talking about grading, you have to consider the whole system. It's integrated. Now, let's talk a little bit about historical timeline. I mentioned 2006. The law is passed that says that by 2008. Now, to be fair, most school districts did not know where to start. We were fortunate enough in this district that around the time that the law came to fruition, there were some funds available. They were the ARA funds. The federal government gave the Recovery Act funds to try to stimulate the economy. And the school district received $120,000 in ARA funds that we had to target toward, there was a proposal that we made. And the proposal that we made was that we were trying to purchase, because we knew that we could never do this with district funds, it would be cost prohibitive. We purchased a grading software system that would track competency over time, right? It's really hard to track competency, which is not a traditional system, when all you have at your disposal is a traditional grading tool. So we purchased a software system. We actually helped to develop the software system to help track. That was around 2008. So this process has been, since 2008 up until now, at least a decade-long process. I'm not going to go through every one of the things, but in the presentation I'm going to post, there's a link here, and you click that link. There is a timeline, and it's very small, but online you can see it if you're looking at your computer. Essentially what this is it tells all the viewers, this is the year 2008, 2009, 2009, 2010, 11, 12, 12, 13, and as you scroll down, we have 13, 14, 14, 15, 15, 16. And it has all of the things that we've done around grading and reporting in a historical perspective. So you can see how we phase this in. The point that I'm trying to make with this historical timeline is that not only is there a system that's at play, but the system is part of a historical movement that the district has made from having a very traditional system to a system based on competency-based education. The 1 year that's missing from that chart is 2017, 2018. Many of the board members here will recognize these topics. These are the main things that we did last year that we focused on. Defensive learning and student exhibitions. So I've presented a number of occasions on how student exhibitions fit into our system of competency-based learning. For the audience, what we will say is that the district is moving through a K through 12 implementation of student exhibitions where they defend their competency at all grade levels. It may look different, age appropriate. At the elementary school, it might be a student-led conference where the student takes responsibility for the traditional parent-teacher conference. Instead of the teacher being the center of focus, it's the student who's the center of focus and the student is explaining their learning. It might look different in the upper elementary and the middle school and the high school. The high school, for example, may have a system in place where the students upon graduation have to demonstrate competency in a high-stakes environment. Like when I got my master's degree, I had to meet in front of a panel and they questioned me about my learning. So we've spent a lot of time last year. There are a number of teachers in the audience who are participating in that student exhibition learning experience. It continues into this year. We spent an entire year looking at defining what college and career readiness is. This was a huge task. It required a lot of research into what is the data telling us that kids need to have in order to be successful in college. We are aligning our deeper learning competencies, our work study practice competencies with the state model, where we have a group of teachers who are experimenting with a multi-year progression of learning where you might have kids in a classroom working on first grade standards, but some of those kids that are advanced might also be working on second and third grade standards, right? This move when ready type mentality that really pushes learning and addresses rigor. And we've also been constructing, and Dr. Conan is here from the math department, what has been really a 4-year process of redesigning our math into an integrated math model first. So we have Math 1, Math 2, Math 3, which combines Algebra 1, Geometry, Algebra 2, and some statistics into a system where, like in that elementary model where kids can move when ready, we're approaching that and working on that same model at the high school. So a student might actually start Math 1 in September, but if that student is high achieving and moves quickly, they might in February actually complete Math 1 and begin Math 2 in the same classroom. So this idea of really pushing students to move when they're ready. So I want to talk now, so you have a little bit of a history of the law and a little bit of the history of how we've implemented that you can look at a later date. Let's talk a little bit about, first off, remembering that there's a system in play and that there's a plan and historical perspective to consider. I want to take a look at what we faced when we started to implement competency-based grading. So now I'm going to switch gears a little bit. Instead of talking in general about competency-based education, I'm going to start to go a little more deeply into grading and the challenges that we faced with a traditional grading system and trying to make that competency-based. And the two are like oil and water. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So the first teaching point is that what we discovered, and many of the experts around the country have discovered, and actually across the world now, because this movement is actually an international movement to redesign the way that we teach our kids and the way that we assess their learning. The first thing that we discovered is that the traditional grading system is inaccurate and inadequate to determine competency. I'm going to explain that. The whole rest of my conversation with you is going to be talking about how it is inaccurate and how it is inadequate and how the system that we've built is different. So I had a question by a board member who said, why can't we just undo what we've done and go back to a traditional letter grade system? The first response to that is, I've only been here 9 years. Mr. Stack's been here 13. Ms. Mosley?
Don't tell.
I won't tell. I don't ever recall in any documentation that I've ever seen that we've ever had a letter grade system. We just haven't had letter grades. There have been number grades, percent, 0 to 100. But just for purposes of illustrating, some of you may have gone to schools that had letter grades. On the left-hand side is what might be a typical scale. So if you got an A+, that's usually 97% or higher. So when I came here, so first of all, on this scale, 60% is the minimum passing grade, right? And below that, we have 59 degrees of failure, or what Doug Reeves, an educational researcher and author, calls 59 degrees of aptitude. His point with that is you don't really need to have 59 degrees of failure. Is 59 failing, but 49 is really failing, and 39 is really, really failing? The point is the kid has not mastered the work. He doesn't know it, or she doesn't know it. So prior to our conversion to this 4-point scale, which I'm going to talk about, at SAU 17, the actual passing grade was 65%, not 60 that you see on this typical scale. So you have to ask yourself in the traditional system, and there are folks here I'm recognizing who work in school districts that have the 100% scale. Many of us as educators, myself included, worked in the system that had the 100% scale. So the things that I'm saying to the educators in the room, you're going to be going, yep, that's how it works. For those of you in the audience who don't know how the grading system worked in a traditional system, I'm going to try to unveil some of the weaknesses of the system. So in a traditional system, it's what we refer to as a points accumulation system. You're going to understand that a little more in a minute. It's the student's job to earn as many points as possible, right? And there are always formulas involved. I'm going to talk a little bit about those formulas. Sometimes the formulas used to calculate a student's grade is completely dependent upon which teacher they were given, right? So we're going to talk about what that means. Here's an example of a variety of teachers who existed here in the district in 2009. These are not fictitious, right? So in teacher A's classroom, that teacher in the traditional model said, at the end of the year, I can tell you students that your grade is going to be calculated with the following formula. Tests are going to be worth 30% of your overall grade, quizzes are going to be worth 20%, homework is going to be worth 30%, and participation in class is going to be worth 20%. Any of you guys in the audience, does that seem familiar? Lots of heads nodding. Okay. Teacher B, teaching exactly the same course in the room right next door to teacher A, calculates their grades differently. That teacher also gives projects in the class. The other teacher didn't like projects so much. Teacher B has a lot of projects. In fact, weights projects at 25%. So you might have had teacher A for your social studies class, and at the end of the year, your learning was assessed completely differently than teacher B because the formulas were different. And teacher C, as you can see, was even more so. So potential problems with that variability. Now the variability that I'm talking about is not just at Sanborn. You could literally walk into almost any school that uses a traditional system, and this is exactly what you would find. You would find variability from classroom to classroom, teacher to teacher, and they calculate their grades differently. Now, what are some of the problems caused by variability? Well, first of all, there's a high degree of variability not only in the grading, but the final outcome for students. How they're being assessed and how that's being reported to colleges. You could have two kids who know exactly the same amount of knowledge and apply in exactly the same way and having two completely different grades. It's very difficult when you have a system like that to compare scores across students, so little Johnny to little Susie, or across teachers. So we always talk about teacher performance, and we want to, and there's a lot of discussion, out in the country about using teacher performance as a means to determine teacher pay. I'll tell you right now, until this is addressed, you should never do that, because the outcomes that students face are completely different based on the teachers, and you can't really rely on the grading when there's that much variability. It also causes a huge problem for us to try to create a set point for what is mastery or competency or proficiency. When you have such variability in the system, where do you set the target for competency? So another issue of variability in the system is that most traditional systems use what I call parking lots. You know these as quarter-based systems. So in your school, when you were a kid, you might have had quarter 1, and a grade in quarter one, a grade in quarter two. Some of you might have had a midterm exam. You might have had a quarter three grade, a quarter four grade, and a final exam. And each of those points that you earned were housed in a parking lot somewhere. At the end of quarter one, the points that you earned were parked somewhere, and we didn't look at them until the end of the year when we added them all together and came up with this mysterious average. So I want to talk about that parking lot system for a minute. Now, in almost every school that has a quarter-based system across the country, almost with complete uniformity, this is the model they use for computing their overall course grade. 4 schools that have quarter one, I see you shaking your head. Does that look familiar? Okay, so in your school or your experience or the school you work in, this is what it is. So quarter one is worth 20% of your overall course grade. Quarter two, 20%, et cetera. So as we go through the year, here's how that parking lot system works. Quarter one, 20% of your overall course grade. At the end of quarter one, if your average for quarter one was 80%, we're going to take 0.8, multiply it there, and we're going to come out with 16 points. Those 16 points are going to be added somewhere off in the parking lot and stored for another 7 months till the end of the year. We're not going to look at them. We're not going to do anything with them. Quarter two, if my average in quarter two was 77, I'm going to do some basic multiplication. I'm going to house 15.4 points off in quarter two parking lot. I'm not going to look at them till the end of the year. And what ends up happening is at the end of the year, I add these points together and I come up with the overall grade. That's how the system works. Now, why is that a problem? You have the illusion of specificity. 81.2 seems so specific. I should be able to tell you exactly how those 81.2 points were accumulated. The reality is they could have been accumulated in any number of fashions. They could be linked to any types of learning. And in fact, I could have 2 kids. Question is, if you have 3 students who've all accumulated 81 points, like I just gave you the example, in a biology class, are there assumptions that I can make about their learning? The answer to that question is no, unless the student had exactly the same teacher or had participated in exactly the same assessments, got exactly the same questions incorrect or correct in those assessments, had the same behavioral grades calculated, and had their points parsed out using exactly the same distribution formula. I can't compare the 3 kids. So a college is looking at students in a biology grade of 81, and that biology grade could have been, those 81 points could have been amassed in any number of possible fashions. So we have a problem. Now, I want to tell you that in most systems, the problem is compounded by what we refer to as participation grades or extra credit points or behavior grades. The gentleman from Newton who asked the question about how are we assessing creativity in a math class, and why does creativity have anything to do with math? The answer is we don't. Yes, we do assess both. They are maintained separately. Those 2 scores never intermix. We think they're both important, and we report them both to colleges. But the behavior type activities, communication, collaboration, creativity, and self-direction, those things never commingle with the academic score. Colleges love that. They want to see a report on that, but they don't want to see the academic scores tainted by those things. So in any system where you have behavior grades, and I'm going to give you some examples of what I mean by behavior grades. I can tell you that have looked at teachers' gradebooks for 20 years as an administrator. One of the most common things you would see in a traditional system, you open up a grade book at the first week of the year, and there's a grade, almost always exclusively, Mr. Stack is smiling because he knows what I'm going to say, where the teacher has given the student a quiz grade, given them 100 on a quiz grade for getting their syllabus signed. So the teacher said, here's my course syllabus, you bring it home to your parents. If you bring it in signed to me, I'm going to give you a quiz grade. What have I done? I have now tainted.
Calling me out because I actually had to sign this last week.
Right.
This is a real life story.
So what I've just done, if I've given students points in my biology class, let's say, for bringing in their course syllabus, that bringing in the course syllabus is a behavior grade. It has nothing to do with whether or not a student can perform in a biology class. I have now tainted that grade. So that's a very big problem because there is a lot of fudge factor in a traditional system. In every one of these examples I gave you, and I will tell you, teachers feel very strongly that class participation is important. They will all tell you that. We still value class participation in the competency-based system. We just separate it out and we don't let it taint the behavior, the academic grade. But there is 20 points of what I call fudge factor here. What does participation mean? If you ask 10 teachers, you'd get 10 different answers. One teacher might say, for me, perfect participation is the student comes to class on time every day with a notebook and material to write, and they raise their hand to ask questions frequently. They participate in the exchange. And they do things like when we do canned good drives at Thanksgiving, they bring in canned good drives. That's what participation is. Now, teachers also know that participation is a little bit of a fudge factor. So if I see little Johnny struggling academically, but is really trying hard, I might increase his participation grade a little bit, right? So when we have these behavior grades added into our system, one of the things we worry about is grade inflation, right? So are our grades really truly reporting academic performance, or do they include things that really have nothing to do with academic performance? And I'm going to talk a little bit about inflation of grades. So I'm going to ask a question. Have you ever heard of the Sanborn A? Anybody in the audience ever heard that term? Some hands are going up. Now, to be fair, there is a version of the Sanborn A in every community. There are people in Exeter who say that there is an Exeter A. There are people in Raymond who say that there is a Raymond A. Here's the gist of what we mean by the Sanborn A. There was a perception in this district that there were students who were going through their 4 years of school and getting straight A's. They were showing up on the honor roll. They were getting distinction at time for their diplomas. And they were earning these A's and yet not being prepared for college. They were going to college and struggling. So the question is, wrong direction. How do students get, how would students be earning points in a traditional system? I want to remind folks that the student's job in a traditional system is to earn points, right? That's their job. Earn points so I can park them off in the parking lot called quarter one, earn points so I can park them off in the parking lot called quarter two, and et cetera. Now, in this model I'm showing you, here's the problem with this model, this traditional grading system. Only 35% of the work that's being graded is probably being done in front of the teacher, right? So I'm going to require tests and quizzes to be done in front of me, but I'm not requiring homework to be done in front of me. I'm probably not requiring projects, and if I assign an essay, I'm going to expect you're going to write that at home. I might start it with you in class. So we have 65% of the points that are being earned that are either unmonitored or their fudge factor, participation grade. That's a huge problem. Additionally, in this system, there are probably other things that are tainting our grade, like extra credit and behavior grades. And additionally, what we've learned, in this system, tests have, and quizzes have a major priority, right? There's a problem with tests and quizzes. They measure a very low depth of knowledge. They measure recall, and they measure some minor explanation. The gentleman from Newton asked, he mentioned analysis and synthesis. He's referring to rigor. We're going to talk about rigor. And one thing you should know about traditional tests and quizzes, they usually operate with very low rigor. And we're going to talk about what's the difference between difficulty and rigor. So what was my reaction when I came to the district from another district and I heard about the Sanborn A? And I worked with teachers on teams and I saw how hard they were working. I was furious. I thought, this is insulting. There's almost an insinuation that teachers are giving away grades, right? That's my gut reaction. I was furious. Now, again, remembering what the student's job is, we have to ask ourselves, did the Sanborn A exist? The gentleman asked for a grade distribution. I don't have the grade distribution for this year. We haven't amassed grades yet. But I can show you what I would refer to as the perfect storm. Perfect storm was 2013. So for the teachers that are in the audience will remember, and for parents, Mrs. Mahoney, you may recall this. We phased many of, and this is Gluck, shake it. We phased many of these new changes in so that they wouldn't negatively impact kids. So if you experienced something in your freshman year, that change rolled up with you to your sophomore year and became your experience. So we had a perfect storm in 2013 because in the year 2013, we were in the second year of our roll-up at the high school level. which meant that roughly half of our student body was being assessed in the traditional model, and half of our student body was being assessed in the new model, rubric-based against student exemplars, anchor papers in these rubrics, 4-point scale. And I have to confess that what we found was we had a Sanborn A. On the left is a chart that shows the grade distribution in 2013 when we had half of the student body on the traditional system, and that big line that goes all the way up, those are the number of kids that earned A's. And you can see very few earned B's, C's, and D's. We had a lot of A's. Now, the other half of the student body that was being assessed at a much more rigorous level, right? A bell curve. Few kids at the top, a lot of kids in the middle, and a few kids that were struggling. So, we had to ask ourselves, what's going on? I know that teachers are not giving away grades, so what we did is an analysis, and we looked at grade books, and we said, what types of assessments are being used in these classes? And here's what we discovered. Almost universally, teachers that were utilizing the traditional grading system were relying heavily on traditional assessments, like paper and pencil tests, for which there is a correct answer and an incorrect answer. Right? These assessments measure a depth of knowledge. We're going to talk about this, level 1 and level 2. Level 1 and level 2 is basic recall. You memorized something, or you had some minor type of explanation that you had to do. These assessments, generally speaking, you can cram for. We've all done it. You cram for it, you study for it, you go to the test the next day, you take the test and you ace it, and if I gave you that same test 3 months from now, you'd fail it, because you didn't actually learn it. You tried to memorize it for the test. So they were not learning to a level where it could be applied to an actual real-world problem, replicated or transferred, right? So that's what we found, that there was a problem with our assessment system. What we found conversely is the teachers who were teaching those rubric-based, 4-point scale classes were relying more heavily on what we refer to as performance assessments. Now, I don't want to get too deeply into performance assessments, but they're complex problems that ask students to transfer knowledge from one discipline to another, solve a real-world problem, and go to a depth of knowledge level 3 or 4. Very rigorous, okay? So that's what we found was happening in the classrooms with the 4-point rubric scale. The assessments were more rigorous. So I will put this online so you can see. I'm going to show you, the gentleman from Newton asked the question about analysis and synthesis. I'm going to show you a document by Dr. Karen Hess, who's a Vermont educator. She's actually a psychometrician. Her whole life is assessment. And Dr. Hess has taken 2 models that, as educators, we're all familiar with, Bloom's taxonomy and Webb's depth of knowledge, and she's created what are now internationally known as Hess's rigor matrices. And this is a sample of a rigor matrix. And this is an English language arts class. I know that because ELA is up here. We have depth of knowledge 1, depth of knowledge 2, depth of knowledge 3, and depth of knowledge 4. As the gentleman from Newton said, we expect kids at the competency-based system to be operating down here. This is where kids analyze complex problems. Synthesize just generally means I can take information from different domains, put it together, and assemble new meaning. Solve complex problems that I may not have been given, but I'm able to draw upon all of my knowledge and gather that information and apply it in a novel way. These Hess rigor matrices are used on a daily basis by our educators when they're building rubrics for assessments for which that they're assessing competency. We believe strongly that you cannot make a determination of competency unless students are operating at this depth of knowledge. Very complex types of learning. So that's an example of a Hess rigor matrix. If you want to learn more, there are Hess rigor matrices for all grade levels in virtually all subject areas, and our teachers use these as a reference on a daily basis. Now, just a comment about rigor and what rigor means, because oftentimes people equate rigor to difficulty. Those two things are vastly different. Example, if you were in a biology class, and let's say it's something more complex than biology, anatomy and physiology course at the high school, and you're studying the Krebs cycle, the energy cycle in cells and in bodies. If I said to you, I'm going to give you 10 very complex words, vocabulary words, tonight from the Krebs cycle in my anatomy and physiology class, and tomorrow we're going to have a quiz on those 10 vocabulary words, right? A different group of kids, I said, I'm going to give you 30 vocabulary words from the Krebs cycle, these very complex science-based vocabulary words, and you're going to have a quiz on those tomorrow. If I asked you which one was more rigorous, many in the audience might say, if the group that you gave 32, and I would say they're exactly the same. They rely on exactly the same skill set. One, it might be more difficult. It's more difficult to memorize 30 words than 10, but the memorization and learning the vocabulary calls upon exactly the same skill set. Now, if I said to one group, you're going to learn these 10 words, in the other group, I say, you're going to learn these 10 words, and you're going to learn to use them appropriately, and I expect to see those words used appropriately in your lab report tomorrow. That is more complex. I must be able to take the data from my lab report, synthesize the data, create a conclusion, and appropriately use those vocabulary words. That's more complex. That's a deeper depth of knowledge. That makes sense? Difficulty is not the same as rigor. Okay, so I'm going to transition to the next part of the presentations, but I couldn't resist this quote from 1976 talking about a traditional grading system by Dr. Paul Dressel. He defined grading this way for a traditional system. It's defined as an inadequate report of an inaccurate judgment by a biased and variable judge of the extent to which a student has attained an undefined level of mastery of an unknown proportion of an indefinite material. What does that mean? It's like nailing Jell-O to the wall. So how have we tried to solve that? When we set out in 2009 to build a competency-based system, we set out to address the problems that were inherent in a traditional grading system. And we looked at every possible problem and tried to create a solution. Now, how did we create that solution? This talks about national experts. One of the things that we did, because we were out ahead of the curve a little bit and really jumped in with both feet, we connected with people from all across the country. I'm going to use a name in a moment of Dr. Ken O'Connor, who's a Canadian educator, who actually volunteered to look at our grading practices and give us feedback on them before we implemented them. So we called him in Toronto and said, could you look at these materials for us? Because we're doing this transformation and we need an outside set of eyes, right? And we'd like it to be university people who've done this research to tell us what we're doing. So the very first thing you should know is when we tried to address the issues is we researched every one of those 31 components to the system, and we said, what do we need to know about grading? And we read everything we could read. We bought books for our teachers. We developed study groups and book clubs, and we set reading schedules, and we set meeting schedules, and we sat down K through 12, and we looked at what the research was telling us. Together, as a faculty, over the years, we've probably read a dozen or more books together. So we built our understanding from within. So how did that look? Well, a lot of research. Here are just a few of the names of the authors, educational experts, people who've done research that we have read. I mentioned Ken O'Connor because, as I mentioned, we used him as a resource to vet all of the changes that we were making to say, is this what the literature is telling you are best practices? He actually gave us some really good feedback, and we made some changes based on that. I'm going to talk about, so there are two names in red, and I put the names in red for a reason. I'm going to just show you, this is Ken O'Connor, just an overview of, he synthesized one of his pieces of writing into 15 steps that school districts should undertake in order to fix the system in the country with broken traditional grading system. All of these issues we've tried to address in our system. I won't read those to you, but I will let you look at that when I post it on the website. It's there as an active link. Tom Guskey is also a name in red. I put Tom Guskey there because he is considered to be the preeminent expert in the country around grading and grading practices. He speaks all over the world about grading practices and how to really get to the heart of learning and using grades to do that. I've uploaded a link for you if you want to look at it later of some of his work, grading and reporting. The link will take you, first of all, Dr. Gusky is from the University of Kentucky. The reason why I say he's one of the world's preeminent experts is they have a task force, a group at the University of Kentucky called the Center for Innovation in Education, and all they do is study and research education practices, right? So he works there. So you'll see a link with Dr. Gusky, some of his writings, and he's written about report cards and transcripts and how to address struggling learners. There are actually some of the books that he's written, copies of slides that he's presented. I tried to make it as comprehensive as I could so that you could see that the material and things that we've done are really deeply researched, and there's a lot of literature that you could read. There are some journal articles that he's written around class rank, other things. So again, just a reference for you. If you'd like to do some reading at your leisure, please feel free to do that. So one of the things that you should know is as we started to build our system, one of the things we were most concerned with is all the variability that existed in the system. And it wasn't just teacher to teacher, classroom to classroom. There was an incredible amount of variability between the buildings, elementary and middle, middle and high. And so one of the things that we've done is try to alleviate the variability so that as kids move through the system, we are reporting consistently on their progress through the curriculum. So there are links here if you want to see what the grading practices are. In a nutshell, the grading practices started at the high school primarily because the high school does something. And the gentleman from Newton asked the question, why are there different grading scales at the elementary level and the high school level? The answer to that question is elementary does not give overall course grades. At the end of the year, there's no final grade. We report only on the student's proficiency on the standards, okay, at the elementary. The high school is a different beast. At the high school, we are required to award credits based on mastery. So in order to attain those credits, our scale looks a little different. We have to have an overall course grade, right? At least in the system we have now where we compute grade point average and class rank. If we ever were to move away from those two things, which I don't ever see us doing, we could look at that. There is a link here for each of the grading practices. So if you want to know what the grading practices are at the elementary school, they're basically the high school grading practices made age appropriate for the elementary. So if you look at this, you're going to see the same definition of what we call a formative assessment, what's the purpose of, grades, what are grading procedures that students are expected to take, how they give academic scores, how they give work-study practice scores. You might see some differences between the documents because, for example, at the elementary level, the work-study practices they use are called CARES. Those CARES come from a program that we implement in our elementary schools called the responsive classroom, right? So at the elementary, we call them CARES. At the high school, we call them work-study practices. But there is a tremendous amount of consistency. The documents are all essentially the same. If you look at the high school, you're going to see the grading practices almost exactly the same. We have the types of grades that we use, and you can look at those at your leisure. The general point is there's no variability now between the buildings, and teacher to teacher, we use exactly the same reporting system. So what are some of those other types of variability that we've removed? All teachers now in our system, pre-K through 12, use a mixture of different types of assessments. Where before we relied more heavily on traditional paper and pencil tests, now we use a variety of assessments, including really deep and rich performance assessments, right? And for those of you who have been around long enough, know that we participate in the national program called PACE, Performance Assessments of Competency Education, a program that's been awarded lots of praise by the U.S. Department of Education. It's a statewide initiative in which we participate. Performance assessments for competency education, we've received a tremendous amount of professional development on how to build very high quality performance assessments, which have then bled out throughout our entire school district. Also, removing variability from the system. All of our teachers use the same sort of weighting. Summative assessments that are linked to competencies and standards account for almost the entire weight of a student's grade, 90%. We do allow students to give up to 10% of their overall course grade in what we refer to as formative assessments, which as a layperson you should think of as practice, right? We think of the summative assessment as the game, right? And the formative assessment is the practice. You can try out lots of things in practice that you may not actually want to use in the game. It's what happens in the game that's most important. What's the score? And diagnostic is a measure that we use that we don't assign a weight to. The gentleman from Newton asked how, again, how do we use these work, study, practice? Another issue that we addressed is we completely removed any of the fudge factor, any of the behavior grades that tainted academic grades. Now they are separately kept completely separate, and in fact, the student scores are housed in two completely different buckets. Those buckets are never mixed, and on the report card, they show up in two separate spots. We're going to talk a little bit about the report cards in a minute. We do assess work, study, practice. Essentially, the state model is creativity, collaboration, communication, and self-directed learning. At the elementary school, we map the CARES to those four. We also use the same performance level scales, for example, at the elementary. So if you were to go to the report card, you would see this scale that says exemplary, proficient, in progress, limited proficient, and then there's some override codes that are there. What's important is if you were to look at this definition of what exemplary means, it means the student consistently and independently demonstrates the ability to analyze and synthesize essential content and skills in a novel task or a new task. If you were to break those break down into four components. Those four variables, a student must demonstrate all four variables in order to earn an E. Now, some of those variables you can't demonstrate on one assessment, right? Because consistency is a key component. Consistency requires repeated performance over time. So in order to get a 4, a student must demonstrate a high level of performance on that competency over multiple assessments. They must be able to operate independently. So there are some students who cannot operate independently, and the gentleman from Newton asked, why would you have proficiency set for a student who can't operate independently? So there are some students who can perform the task today with some guidance from the teacher, but we're not ready to say that that student is proficient without that level of independence. That student's proficiency is basic at best, right? So we're not saying the student is proficient. In fact, we're saying if he can't do it with independence, he's not proficient, right? If that student needs guidance from a teacher or an aide, and they need that guidance consistently over time, we would not say that student is proficient. If they can demonstrate it today, that's good, but we would want that student to demonstrate it next week independently as well. And we see that with some of our learners. They might be able to demonstrate it independently today, but if you ask them to demonstrate it a month from now, they might have forgotten the task and would need some guidance. They're not proficient. So if we look at the middle and high school, we see almost exactly the same scale. Exemplary, proficient. The difference is basic proficient. Why do we have basic when the elementary had a different term? Elementary has in progress. The elementary parents at the time didn't like basic proficiency. They wanted some scale that denoted that the student was making progress. So we changed. At the elementary level, we gave the parents what it was that they felt was most important. Again, the high school level, same 4 variables built into the scale. Now let's talk a little bit about report cards, right? So again, 9 years ago, high degree of variability in what was being reported on report cards. The elementary schools weren't even consistently reporting the same things, and it looked completely different when you moved from elementary to middle and middle to high. So we redrafted our report cards, and the report cards now all have a section that describes what the performance level indicators are. We have a section where the students' academic competency scores are distributed on a 4-point scale. We have a section where the students' CARES or work-study practice achievement is recorded. And we have a section where teachers can make comments. I only put one report card on here because they're all virtually the same. But here's a report card, and what I'm talking about, we have the performance level descriptors. What is an A? What does exemplary mean? We have a section at the top where the CARES or work-study practice scores are. You notice that these are separate from the academic scores. We have the descriptor that describes the academic scores, and then we have the portion of the report card. I want to draw your attention to the fact that this, where it says reading up at the top here, there is a competency called reading. There are different types of reading that we do. For example, we do informational text, we do literary text. In reading at the elementary, they also measure foundational reading skills and word identification and vocabulary. Those are the standards that we report on at the elementary level. Now, the one difference between the middle school and, the high school and elementary is that because students don't have to get credits in the elementary, we don't have a rule about overall course grades and standards. What I can tell you at the high school is that in order to earn credit for any course at the high school, students must demonstrate mastery of every competency and the overall grade must be passing, right? That's a very rigorous task to achieve. Performance on every competency and performance in the overall course grades. Now, oh, I've got to X out of here, sorry. This is just the second page of the report card. So that gives you a little bit about how we tried to address the variability in report cards in the system that we built. Now let's talk a little bit about rubrics and how we measure student growth and student performance. Rubrics are the heart of our system. You've probably heard and you saw in the report cards, we have a 4-point system now. You heard Mr. Stack mention and you heard Ms. Gluck mention earlier her daughter applying for college and the fact that they like our 4-point scale because it looks just like a college 4-point scale. That didn't happen by accident, by the way, right? That was obviously a deliberate move on our part. So what is a rubric? Well, we use these rubrics, these charts, to define the attributes of quality work. We explicitly describe the criteria used to measure performance and performance levels. We define what evidence is going to be sought in the assessment. We establish a baseline for what students must do to be considered proficient or competent. We link assessments to standards and competencies, and we provide feedback to students on how to improve their learning. So that if a student doesn't demonstrate mastery on the first time, we can actually explicitly tell them what skills they must work on to go back and achieve that level of mastery. That's where the intervention program comes in. So here's an example. It's very small. You can look at this at your leisure. This is a grade 4, believe it or not, rubric, and it's from our PACE program. Now, on the left-hand column in a little bit larger size, what you can see is across the top 4, 3, 2, and 1, and across this column are the criteria. In this case, they're state or national standards, and a description of what a student must do in that standard to get a 4, right? Now, here's the catch. In order to get a 4, you have to demonstrate all of these skills. If you get some of the skills, but a 3 in others, you get the 3. This is a very, very rigorous system, okay? Now, there are some folks who believe it's too rigorous, that you got to give kids a little bit of leeway. We say, look, if you're going to fly an aircraft, you better master all the components of flying that aircraft. If you flunk the landing part, it's a big problem, right? So we say you have to demonstrate mastery of all of these in order to get a 4. For us to say you're exemplary, you need to do it all. So in this rubric, we have the criteria clearly listed here in this column. Competency standards are clearly listed in here. Performance level indicators, what it means to get a 4, 3, 2, or 1. All expectations are clearly delineated. You must achieve all expectations. And competencies and standard scores are entered into the gradebook this way. So if a student gets a 4 on this standard, we report a 4 in this standard. If they got a 2, we report a 2 on this standard. Over time, we can track students' performance on every standard in our gradebook. We can pinpoint with complete accuracy what skills kids can do and what skills they can't do, because we track to standards and competencies, not to this variable system of points of accumulation where kids park points off into some parking lot. We are working with a high degree of specificity. So what is a standard report? What it would look like if I go into the gradebook? Here's an example. Here's an art class. This is a ceramics class, right? So I chose this because all of these topics that I'm talking about, these are not just for really deep academic topics like, art. Art has its own curriculum and its own academic rigor. So in art, we have this competency called creativity or creating. And there are 4 standards. These standards are national art standards. These aren't standards that we just, magically dreamed up. This in the art world are the competencies that artists use to measure student performance at really deep, meaningful levels. generating, conceptualizing, and organizing artistic ideas is a standard in our system. In this case, a student over the course of a year earned a 2.6 as an average in that standard. Now, I use average loosely because it may not actually be mathematically an average, but I can talk about that a little bit later. So we can drill down to the exact skill that a student needs to work on. And remember, at the high school, they have to demonstrate, they have to have a passing grade in all of these, right? You can't fail one and pass the course. Very rigorous. Okay, so as I mentioned, in order to pass around, complete all competencies and receive an overall passing grade. We can also go into our system and create a report that's a little bit more complex. I'm going to show it to you just because this is a report that teachers will use with kids. Now, there isn't a lot of data here because I just ran the report. It's early in the year. There's not a lot of assignments in the report. But all of here's a competency called reading. And under reading, in this case, we have 1, 2, 3, 4 standards, 4 national standards listed under that competency. They are literary reading, informational reading, comprehension. There are 2 different comprehension strategies that we're assessing. And over time, as kids would take assessments that monitor the growth in this, there would be a lot of scores here. What you can see is, in this case, there are only a couple assignments with these scores that have been linked. It's early in the year. If I ran this report at the end of the year, you'd see reports in all of these competencies and all of these standards. That's how we can report with specificity whether or not our kids are mastering what we're teaching. Again, you can look at that a little more in depth at your leisure. Now, I want to recap for you the system that we developed and the types of things that we've tried to address with that other system that had a lot of variability and not much specificity. First of all, our new system is standards and competency-based, which meets the standards set forth in law. So when I was asked the question, why are we doing what we're doing, my answer could have been quite simple. It's what the law says we have to do, right? So, but knowing that that's law doesn't mean that it can't be also what's right and best for kids and their learning. So first and foremost, our model meets the standard as outlined in the minimum approval standards by the state of New Hampshire. The model is deeply integrated with all other elements of our system. Hopefully, the beginning part, you saw how it's all integrated. You now know how the grading system is integrated with rubrics and how rubrics are integrated with assessments and how assessments are integrated with intervention. It's a very complex system that we developed to make sure that kids are learning at very deep levels. All components have been research-based and were studied extensively before implementation, not only locally, but we have also partnered with folks from Stanford University, the SCALE project. We're partnered with the Center for Assessment, which is a national leader in psychometrics and assessment out of Dover, New Hampshire. We get a lot of guidance from the New Hampshire Department of Education. As I mentioned, we've reached out to experts all across the country. We've had Linda Darling-Hammond from Stanford University, who's provided professional development. We've had, as I mentioned, Ken O'Connor from Canada looking at our work. We've had our teachers go to formative assessment training with Dr. Margaret Heritage, who is not only the national but world's foremost expert in the field of formative assessment. We have some teachers who are enrolling in a course that she is teaching, Margaret Heritage. These are deeply researched practices. The variability in the system that existed has largely been eliminated. So now we have a system that meets the highest standards for validity. We know what we're assessing, and what we're assessing is actually the skills that we're supposed to be teaching. It's reliable, the data is comparable, and there's equity built into the system. The student work is measured against national standards and competencies if they exist. Not all fields have nationally adopted standards. Most do. Social studies, English, mathematics, science, all have nationally adopted. Art has nationally adopted standards. World language has nationally adopted standards. That student work is being measured against those standards, rubrics, anchor papers, and exemplars. The district's grading scales and rubrics utilize the same performance level indicators, pre-K through 12. As kids come up through the system, we now have kids coming up into the middle school who are talking in IEP meetings, in guidance department meetings, in parent conferences. They're talking about areas where they're proficient and competent and areas where they are not, and they're talking about their learning for the first time in my 26 years in education, I've never heard kids talking about their learning the way that they're talking about their learning now. Performance assessments and rubrics share common expectations for high-quality work, so we now can set standards for depth of knowledge and rigor. We've removed all academic grades away from the behavior grades, and we compute those separately. So when we report academic scores to colleges, we report the pure academic performance that kids are demonstrating, not tainted by other things. Our reporting system allows for the development of clearly articulated performance criteria, so we can actually define what proficiency and competency means. We have no parking lots for points. This is something I didn't mention earlier, but a critical component of our system is we have one grading term. It opens on September 1st, or the first day of school, and closes on June 15th, or whatever the last day of school is. And the reason we do that is, as you remember our definition of what exemplary work is, required consistency over time. If you're parking points in these parking lots and not going back to that learning till the end of the year, you can't possibly track a student's performance consistently over time on those standards. So we have one grading term. It opens on the first day of school and it closes on the last day of school. We do take snapshots and send those home, so parents in the elementary school might receive a report card for trimester 1, trimester 2, trimester 3, but it's all one grading term. We have addressed grade inflation issues. So the Sanborn A no longer exists. We see the typical bell curve in our grading. Our current system mirrors a college 4-point scale, which, by the way, they love. It allows for easy comparison and generation of a grade point average that mirrors the college grade point average. We now have equal distance between each performance level. One of the key problems in a traditional grading system is that a student in a traditional grading 100% scale, if they have one low grade, that one low grade can impact their performance in the class for the entire year. If you have 1 0 in a class, in a traditional system, you must have 9 perfect papers, 9 100s, in order to overcome the damage that was done by that 1 0. And that 0 causes so much damage because there's such a variability between the grading scale levels. In a system like a 4, 3, 2, 1, there's exactly the same distance between a 0 and a 1 and a 2, a 3 and a 4, and a 4 and a 5. We no longer have 59 degrees of aptitude, as Doug Reeve refers to them. We have an incredibly high degree of rigor built into the system. I mentioned not only the expectations for performance and the rigor built there, but I also mentioned the level of rigor of having to achieve mastery or proficiency in all of those individual competencies, as well as passing your overall course grade. And we can now track student performance at the standard level, at the competency level, and at the overall grade level. So we can run reports at any given time on which students are struggling, which students need intervention, which students need more time, which students need maybe some extra instruction. We have that data now. I did mention colleges. I want to show you one thing, again, that you can look at your leisure. And this was addressed by Mrs. Gluck earlier when she referred to her daughter applying for college. Every year we update this, but this is our profile, school profile. So whenever a student applies to college, this piece of paper goes with their application. And this is something that every school does, by the way. This is not a Sanborn thing. And it shows everything from what our statistics are for our SAT scores. It talks about our grading system. It talks about, what is a 4, 3, 2, and 1. Our grading practices are defined. What does competency mean? Every school sends one of these, and this is ours. You can look at that a little bit longer if you would like. So because I mentioned college, I will tell you that over the last 9 years, personally, myself, as well as members of the team, have met with over 140 admissions officers from schools all across the country, from Purdue University right down to Northern Essex Community College in our backyard. We have reviewed our system. We've received their feedback. Here's what we've consistently heard. First off, they love the model. They love the fact that they compare 4 points to 4 points. They don't have to recalculate and create some other measure for determining where our students are performing against other students in other locations. They love the fact that we continue to report a grade point average, right? So every student on their transcript, their overall final grade point average is calculated. that grade point average is calculated on the same 4-point scale we use for all 4 years of high school. So a student might earn, for example, a final grade point average of 3.7. They might earn a 2.9, and they might earn a 2.3, right? So depending on which college they're applying to, each college might have a minimum standard that they're looking for in terms of grade point average, but almost universally, colleges want to see that grade point average. They also want to continue to see and love to see the fact that we continue to put class rank on our transcripts. So how does one student compare to another student in the school? The class rank essentially lists the number of students that were in that graduating class. Last year there were roughly 150 graduating seniors, and it would give the student whose transcript is being reviewed a number. It would say 5/150. That would mean the student graduated 5th in the class out of 150 students. Colleges want to see that class rank put on there. We continue to do that. They love the ease of comparing the 4-point scale. They like the separation in reporting academic and behavior grades. This is probably the area where we've received the most positive feedback. Colleges know that there is a fudge factor in most schools' traditional grades. They know that there are these things called extra credit. They know that there are these things called participation grades. When they see our system, they realize that all of that has been removed. And when they're looking at academic score, they're looking at pure academic performance. They know exactly what kids know and can do. They also like to see the attendance records. Now, we do report attendance on transcripts that go to colleges. Attendance is critical, right? Showing up is important. If you have two students that have very similar academic scores, very similar work-study practice scores, attendance might be the thing that separates them from another student that's applying, right? So colleges love to see that. I'm going to close with a story by Dr. Rick Dufour. Now, Dr. Rick Dufour, one of the world's preeminent experts in fact, created the concept of professional learning communities, right? He unfortunately passed away this February. And he tells the story of his sister. Late 1980s, around 1988, 89, his sister decided that she had grown tired of wearing eyeglasses, much like myself. And around 1988, 1989, she went to her optometrist and said, I want to lose these glasses. And he said, I have a procedure that we could try that might help you to get rid of your glasses. And the procedure is called radial keratotomy. And if you don't know what it is, you should Google it because it is barbaric. But we did this as recently as 1980s, late 1980s. For those of you who don't know what it is, radial keratotomy is surgery, and they do it on one eye at a time. They put you under general anesthesia, knock you out, and the surgeon takes a scalpel and makes dozens of small incisions on your eyeball. In some cases, 100 incisions. And what they're doing is trying to reshape your eyeball so that maybe after 3 or 4 or 5 months of recovery and dropping antibacterial ointment in your eye every day, because infection is one of the most dangerous aspects of radial keratotomy, maybe 4 or 5 months later after the healing process is done, you might have 20/20 vision out of your right eye. And guess what? Now you get to go through the process again with your left eye. And they can't do it on both eyes at the same time because for quite a period of time, like a month, you have to wear an eye patch. You can't have any light at all. So you would essentially be blinded. So they do one eye at a time. And so after 6 or 7 months, if you're lucky, you have 20/20 vision. After you've gone through the literal physical agony of pain of recuperating through that surgery. Rick Dufour talks about his sister's experience with radial keratotomy surgery, and he says, imagine today if you walked into your optometrist office and you said, like I might do tomorrow, I'd really like to get rid of my eyeglasses, and my doctor says, oh, Michael, I've got this great experience. I could give you radial keratotomy surgery. That would be akin to medical malpractice because we don't use that anymore. We have a better system. It's called LASIK, right? You go into laser surgery, 5 minutes per eye. They do both eyes at the same time. It costs you maybe $3,500. The next day you wake up and you see 20/20 vision. Throw your glasses away, right? So painless, virtually painless, done in 5 minutes, almost no risk to infection. Dr. Dufour's point is, today, knowing what we know about education, the formation of schools, how we organize teachers, how we assess kids, how we teach and how we learn, if we don't use modern practices to assess and teach learning and to grade kids, it would be akin to our educators essentially being educational malpractice, right? We know better today, and we know some of the systems that were created 30 and 40 years ago don't give us the type of information we need to help kids advance in their teaching and learning. Remember, there's something different that we do today that we didn't do even 10 years ago. We teach every kid. Every kid that comes through our door, we're expected to reach to high standards. As recently as 10 years ago, there were kids dropping out of high school in New Hampshire, dropping out of high school from Sanborn at age 16. And the reality was most of them dropped out at 15. They just stopped coming to school knowing they could sign the papers at 16. We teach kids now until 18, and there is no dropout now. If you look at our dropout rate, it's less than 0.5% at Sanborn Regional High School. We are doing a remarkable job teaching and having our kids learn to high levels, right? So knowing what we know today, we have to use the techniques that we know are best practices. With that, I will close. Thank you. I'll entertain questions from the board if you have any.